The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as the royal car pulled through the gates. Prince George pressed his face against the window, watching the familiar towers and walls come into view. At 11 years old, he had visited this place many times before, but today felt different somehow. "Remember what we discussed about today's schedule," his mother Catherine said softly, adjusting his tie one final time. "We'll be meeting with the castle staff, touring the new exhibition, and then attending the ceremony in St. George's Chapel." Prince George nodded, though his attention was already drifting to the castle grounds outside. Red-coated guards stood like statues along the pathways, their tall black hats making them look even more impressive. He had always been fascinated by these men who stood so perfectly still, no matter what happened around them. His father, Prince William, was reviewing some papers, occasionally glancing up to point out historical details about the castle. "See that tower there, George? That's where your great-great-grandmother, Queen Mary, used to spend her summers when she was your age." The car came to a gentle stop near the main entrance, where a small group of officials waited to greet them. Castle staff in their formal uniforms stood ready, along with several members of the household division who would escort them throughout the day. As they stepped out of the vehicle, Prince George immediately felt the weight of formality settle around him like an invisible cloak. Cameras clicked from a respectful distance as photographers captured their arrival. He had grown used to this attention over the years, but sometimes he still wondered what it would be like to visit places without everyone watching his every move. The head of Windsor Castle operations, a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes, stepped forward to greet them. "Your Royal Highnesses, welcome to Windsor Castle. We're delighted to have you here today for the exhibition opening." Prince William shook hands warmly while Catherine smiled and exchanged pleasantries. Prince George stood slightly behind them, observing everything with the careful attention his parents had taught him. He noticed how the staff members stood a little straighter when his family approached, how their faces showed a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The castle grounds were particularly beautiful that day. The spring flowers had begun to bloom in the carefully maintained gardens, and the ancient walls seemed to glow in the soft morning light. Tourists were already gathering in designated areas, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family during their visit. As they began walking toward the main entrance, Prince George found himself studying the royal guards positioned along their route. These weren't just any soldiers. They were members of the elite regiments that had protected British royalty for centuries. Each guard stood perfectly motionless, their rifles held at exactly the right angle, their eyes focused straight ahead. He remembered the stories his grandfather, King Charles, had told him about these guards, how they trained for months to achieve such perfect stillness, how they considered it the highest honor to protect the royal family, how they had to remain at their post no matter what happened, whether it was pouring rain, blazing heat, or crowds of curious tourists. "The changing of the guard ceremony will take place in about an hour," the castle official explained as they walked. "Perhaps your Royal Highness would like to observe from the private viewing area?" Prince George's eyes lit up at this suggestion. He loved watching the precision and ceremony of the guard changes. The way the soldiers moved in perfect synchronization, their boots clicking on the cobblestones in rhythm, their commands shouted with crisp authority. As they continued their walk, Prince George noticed more details about the guards. Some looked very young, probably not much older than teenagers. Others appeared more seasoned, with weathered faces that spoke of years of service. All of them maintained the same unwavering focus and dedication to their duty. The morning air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of the castle gardens and the distant sounds of London beyond the walls. Prince George breathed it in deeply, feeling grateful for these moments when he could appreciate the history and tradition that surrounded his family. His parents were discussing the day's schedule with the castle officials, their voices creating a gentle murmur of conversation as they walked. Occasionally, his mother would glance back to make sure he was keeping up and paying attention to the important details being shared. The path they were taking would lead them through several courtyards, before reaching the main exhibition hall. Each area of the castle told a different story, from medieval times when kings and queens held court here, to more recent history when it served as a refuge during World War II. Prince George had always felt a special connection to this place. Unlike Buckingham Palace, which sometimes felt formal and businesslike, Windsor Castle had a warmth to it. Maybe it was because so many generations of his family had lived here, or maybe it was the way the ancient stones seemed to hold centuries of stories within them. As they approached the first major courtyard, more tourists began to gather at the designated viewing areas. Security personnel moved quietly but efficiently to ensure everything remained orderly and safe. Prince George was used to this constant presence of protection, though sometimes he wished he could just walk around like any other child. The royal guards they passed remained perfectly still, even as excited whispers and camera clicks filled the air around them. Prince George admired their discipline and dedication. He knew that behind those stoic expressions were real people, sons, brothers, fathers, who had chosen to serve their country in this very special way. The castle official continued sharing interesting facts about the day's exhibitions and ceremonies, but Prince George found his attention drawn more to the living, breathing tradition represented by the guards themselves. These weren't just tourist attractions or ceremonial decorations. They were active military personnel carrying out one of the most important duties in the realm. As they neared the end of their initial walkthrough, Prince George felt a sense of anticipation building. Something about today felt significant, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The combination of the beautiful spring morning, the impressive castle setting, and the dedicated guards created an atmosphere that seemed charged with possibility. Little did he know that within the next few minutes, he would witness something that would test everything his parents had taught him about respect, duty, and standing up for what's right. The peaceful morning was about to take an unexpected turn that would challenge his understanding of his role as a future king. The royal family had just rounded the corner into the main courtyard when Prince George first heard the laughter. It wasn't the pleasant, respectful kind of laughter that usually accompanied royal visits. This was different, louder, more mocking, with an edge that made him uncomfortable. At first, he couldn't see what was causing the disturbance. His parents and the castle officials were still deep in conversation about the morning's itinerary, their voices mixing with the general hum of activity around the castle grounds. Security personnel maintained their discreet positions, and everything seemed normal on the surface. But as they moved further into the courtyard, the source of the commotion became clear. A small group of tourists had gathered around one of the royal guards stationed near the main walkway. Unlike the other visitors who observed respectfully from a distance, these particular individuals seemed to think the guard was some kind of entertainment. The guard in question appeared to be quite young, probably in his early 20s. He stood at his post with perfect military bearing, his rifle held at the precise angle required by protocol, his eyes focused straight ahead as he had been trained. His red tunic was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his tall bearskin hat added to his impressive stature. But the group of tourists surrounding him seemed oblivious to the respect his position deserved. There were about 5 or 6 of them, clearly visitors from abroad based on their clothing and the way they spoke. They had positioned themselves directly in front of the guard, apparently trying to get him to break his stoic composure. "Hey, statue man," one of them called out, waving his hand directly in front of the guard's face. "Can you see me, hello? Anyone home in there?" The others laughed at this display, encouraging their friend to continue. Prince George felt his stomach tighten as he watched the scene unfold. He had been taught from a very young age about the importance and dignity of the royal guards. These were not performers or attractions. They were serving soldiers with an important job to do. Another tourist, a woman with a loud voice, began making exaggerated faces at the guard, trying to get him to react. "Look at this," she called to her companions. "He's like a robot. Nothing we do makes him move." She then did something that made Prince George's hands clench into fists. She reached out and actually touched the guard's uniform, running her finger along the gold braiding on his sleeve. The guard remained perfectly still, but Prince George could see the slight tension in his jaw that suggested how difficult it was to maintain his composure. "Don't touch him," called out another tourist who was watching. "You're not supposed to do that." But the woman just laughed it off. What's he going to do? "He can't move. Look, he's like a toy soldier." The situation grew worse as more of the group joined in. One man started making silly poses next to the guard while his friend took photos. Another began speaking to the guard in a mock-serious voice, pretending to have a conversation with him. "So, Mr. Guard, what do you think about the weather today? No comment? How about your favorite football team? Still nothing? You're not very good at conversation, are you? Prince George looked around, hoping that someone in authority would step in to stop this disrespectful behavior. But the castle security seemed focused on protecting the royal family's route, and the general tourist crowd was either unaware of what was happening or too uncertain to intervene. The young guard maintained his professional stance throughout the ordeal, but Prince George could see signs that the harassment was affecting him. There was a slight redness around his ears, and his breathing seemed a little more controlled than natural. This was clearly taking all of his training and willpower to endure. What happened next made Prince George feel genuinely angry. One of the tourists, apparently emboldened by the guard's inability to respond, reached out and tried to adjust the guard's hat. The tall bearskin hat was an integral part of the uniform, and touching it was completely inappropriate. The guard couldn't move to stop him, but Prince George could see the flash of frustration in his eyes. This wasn't just disrespectful, it was humiliating. Here was a young man serving his country with honor and dignity, being treated like some kind of carnival attraction. This is ridiculous, Prince George thought to himself. Someone needs to do something. The group continued their inappropriate behavior, seemingly unaware that they were being watched by anyone important. They were too focused on their game of trying to break the guards' composure to notice that a member of the royal family was observing their actions with growing concern. Prince George glanced toward his parents, but they were still engaged in discussion with the castle officials and hadn't noticed the disturbance yet. The security team was maintaining their positions but hadn't identified the situation as requiring intervention. After all, tourists gathering around guards was a common occurrence, and from a distance, it might not have been obvious how inappropriate this particular group's behavior had become. The young prince found himself in an unusual position. Throughout his life, adult problems had always been handled by adults. His parents, security personnel, or other officials had always been there to manage any difficult situations. But right now, in this moment, he was the only person in a position of authority who was aware of what was really happening. The guard's training was impressive. Even under this level of harassment, he maintained his position and composure, but Prince George could see the human being behind the uniform, and that person was being treated with a complete lack of dignity and respect. As the tourists continued their mockery, taking more inappropriate photos and making more attempts to touch the guard's uniform and equipment, Prince George felt a growing sense that something had to be done. The question was, what could an 11-year-old prince do in this situation, and would he have the courage to do it? The morning sun continued to shine down on the ancient castle stones, but the peaceful atmosphere of the royal visit had been shattered by this display of disrespect. Prince George stood at a crossroads, watching injustice unfold before his eyes and feeling the weight of his position in a way he never had before. Prince George's mind raced as he continued to watch the disturbing scene unfold. Everything his parents had taught him about respect, duty, and proper behavior seemed to clash directly with what he was witnessing. The values that had been instilled in him from his earliest memories were being challenged right before his eyes. His grandfather, King Charles, had often spoken to him about the royal guards during their private conversations. "These men represent the very best of our military tradition," the king had said during one of their walks through the palace gardens. "They sacrifice their comfort, their personal time, and sometimes even their safety to protect what we represent as a royal family." Prince George remembered asking his grandfather once what it felt like to stand so still for so long. "I imagine it takes incredible strength," King Charles had replied thoughtfully. "Not just physical strength, but mental strength. They must ignore distractions, discomfort, even mockery sometimes. It's one of the most challenging duties in our armed forces." Now, watching this young guard endure exactly that kind of mockery, Prince George understood what his grandfather had meant. This wasn't just about standing still, it was about maintaining dignity and professionalism in the face of whatever challenges came their way. The prince's education had included many lessons about the history of the royal guards. He knew about the Battle of Waterloo, where the Grenadier Guards had helped defeat Napoleon. He had learned about their role during World War II, when they had protected the royal family. During the London Blitz, these weren't just ceremonial soldiers. They were part of a proud military tradition that stretched back centuries. But the tourists, harassing the guard, clearly knew nothing about this history. To them, he was just an oddly dressed man standing very still, providing them with entertainment. They had no understanding of the honor and sacrifice that his position represented. Prince George felt his cheeks burning with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. This was happening at one of the most important royal residences, during an official visit right under his family's noses. How could people be so disrespectful in such a sacred place? He looked more closely at the young guard and tried to imagine what he must be thinking. The man's training would have prepared him for many things: hostile situations, security threats, extreme weather conditions. But had anyone prepared him for this kind of public humiliation? Did his instructors teach him how to maintain his dignity while tourists treated him like a street performer? The guard's face remained perfectly composed, but Prince George was learning to read the subtle signs of stress and discomfort. There was a slight tightness around the man's eyes, and his breathing seemed just a bit more controlled than natural. His hands gripped his rifle with perhaps slightly more tension than necessary. Prince George wondered about the guard's family. Did he have parents who were proud of his service? Maybe siblings who looked up to him? A girlfriend who admired his dedication to duty? How would they feel if they could see him being mocked and humiliated like this? The thought of his own family's reaction made Prince George's stomach clench. His parents had always emphasized the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their position in life. A true leader protects those who serve under them, his father had once told him. Our strength comes not from our position, but from how we use that position to help others. But right now, instead of being protected, this guard was being subjected to treatment that no human being should have to endure, and the people responsible seemed to think it was all just harmless fun. Prince George's training in royal protocol had taught him to observe situations carefully before acting. He had been shown how to read a room, how to assess whether intervention was appropriate, and how to gauge the potential consequences of different actions. All of that training was now screaming at him that what he was witnessing was wrong. The tourists were becoming more emboldened with each passing minute. One of them had started making exaggerated military salutes in front of the guard, while another was attempting to march back and forth in a mocking imitation of military drill. Their laughter was getting louder and more disruptive, and other tourists were beginning to notice the commotion. Some of the other visitors looked uncomfortable with what they were seeing. A few elderly tourists shook their heads disapprovingly and moved away from the area. A family with young children seemed to be trying to shield their kids from witnessing the inappropriate behavior. But no one was stepping forward to actually stop it. Prince George realized that most people probably felt the same way he did, that the behavior was wrong, but didn't feel they had the authority or position to intervene. Tourists didn't want to cause an international incident by confronting other tourists. Castle staff might be uncertain about how to handle the situation without causing a bigger disruption. But Prince George wasn't just any tourist or staff member. He was a member of the royal family. These guards served to protect him and his family. Didn't that give him not just the right, but perhaps even the responsibility to speak up for them when they couldn't speak up for themselves? The young prince found himself studying his parents and the castle officials they were speaking with. They were about 30 feet away, completely absorbed in their conversation about the day's schedule and the historical significance of various castle features. Their backs were turned to the harassment taking place behind them. Part of Prince George hoped that one of the adults would notice what was happening and handle it. That would be the normal course of events, adults solving adult problems while children observed and learned. But as the minutes ticked by and the harassment continued, it became clear that the adults weren't aware of the situation. The guard's composure remained remarkable, but Prince George was beginning to worry about the psychological impact of what he was enduring. This young man had probably joined the military with dreams of serving his country honorably. He had likely undergone months of rigorous training to earn his position as a royal guard, and now he was being reduced to the role of unwilling entertainer for people who had no appreciation for his service or sacrifice. Prince George felt a strange sensation growing in his chest, something he had never quite experienced before. It was a combination of righteous anger, protective instinct, and a sudden, crystal-clear understanding of what his position as a future king truly meant. It wasn't just about ceremonies and protocols and wearing the right clothes. It was about using whatever power and influence he had to protect people who needed protection. The moment of realization hit him like a physical force. He wasn't just a child observing an unfortunate situation. He was Prince George, future King of England, and one of his subjects was being mistreated right in front of him. The question wasn't whether he should do something. The question was what he should do and whether he would have the courage to do it. Prince George stood frozen in place, his mind spinning with conflicting thoughts and emotions. Every instinct told him that what he was witnessing was wrong, but everything he had been taught about royal protocol seemed to warn against taking action without proper authorization. The internal battle raging in his young mind was unlike anything he had ever experienced. On one side was his natural sense of justice, the part of him that wanted to march over to those tourists and tell them exactly what he thought of their behavior. On the other side was years of careful instruction about the importance of following proper procedures and never acting impulsively in public situations. His royal education had emphasized the weight that came with every action a member of the royal family took. Remember, his private tutors had told him countless times, everything you do reflects not just on yourself but on the entire monarchy. People watch you constantly, looking for signs of what kind of king you might become someday. But what kind of king would he be if he stood by and watched while one of his future subjects was being humiliated and disrespected? What would that say about his character, his values, and his understanding of true leadership? Prince George glanced again at his parents, hoping desperately that they might turn around and notice what was happening. His father, Prince William, would know exactly what to do. His mother, Catherine, would handle the situation with perfect grace and firmness. They had years of experience dealing with difficult public situations, and they would know how to stop the harassment without creating a bigger incident. But they remained engrossed in their conversation with the castle officials, their attention focused on the historical artifacts they would be viewing later in the morning. The security personnel were maintaining their positions, watching for potential threats to the royal family, but not recognizing that one of their own colleagues was under a different kind of attack. The young prince felt completely alone in his awareness of the situation. It was a strange and frightening feeling to be the only person in a position of authority who understood what was really happening and could potentially do something about it. His mind raced through the possible consequences of different actions. What if he left his parents' side to confront the tourists? Would that create a security concern? Would it disrupt the carefully planned schedule for the day? Would it embarrass his family or cause an international incident? But then another voice in his head asked different questions. What if he did nothing? What would happen to that young guard's sense of dignity and self-worth? How many other guards might face similar treatment if people thought such behavior was acceptable? What would his own conscience tell him later when he looked back on this moment? Prince George remembered a conversation he'd had with his great-grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, shortly before her death. They had been walking through the gardens at Balmoral when she had stopped to speak with one of the groundskeepers, who was having difficulty with a heavy wheelbarrow. "Your Majesty, please don't trouble yourself," the man had said, clearly embarrassed that the Queen had noticed his struggle, but she had insisted on calling over some other staff to help him, and afterward she had turned to Prince George with a serious expression. "Remember this moment," she had said. "Our position is not just about privilege, it's about responsibility. When we see someone who needs help, and we have the power to provide that help, we have a duty to act." Those words echoed in his mind now as he watched the harassment continue. His great-grandmother would not have hesitated in this situation. She would have found a way to help that guard while maintaining the dignity of the monarchy, but she had decades of experience to guide her decisions. Prince George was just 11 years old, with no experience handling anything like this on his own. The tourists seemed to be getting more creative in their attempts to break the guard's composure. One of them was now standing directly beside the guard, mimicking his posture and making exaggerated facial expressions. Another was taking video footage, apparently planning to share the entertainment on social media. Prince George felt sick thinking about that video being posted online, potentially going viral, with millions of people around the world laughing at the humiliation of a British royal guard. The damage to the guard's dignity would be magnified beyond imagination, and it would reflect poorly on the entire institution that Prince George would someday lead. Time seemed to be moving in slow motion as the prince weighed his options. He could walk over to one of the security personnel and quietly alert them to the situation. That would be the safe, protocol-following approach, but it would take time, and by then the damage might already be done. The videos might already be recording, the humiliation might already be complete. or he could approach the situation directly himself. The thought terrified him, but it also felt right in a way that surprised him. This wasn't about breaking protocol. This was about understanding what protocol was really for. Rules and procedures existed to serve a purpose, not to prevent people from doing the right thing when it truly mattered. Prince George thought about the guards' training and dedication. How many hours had this young man spent learning to march in perfect formation? How many early mornings had he endured during basic training? How much pride had he felt when he first put on that red uniform and took his place among the elite soldiers who protected the royal family? All of that training, dedication, and pride was being mocked by people who saw him as nothing more than an amusing distraction. And Prince George was the only person present who both understood the injustice of the situation and had the authority to do something about it. The decision was crystallizing in his mind, even as his heart pounded with nervousness. This wasn't about him being brave or heroic. This was about him being decent. Any decent person would want to help someone being treated unfairly, but most people didn't have the position or influence to make their intervention effective. Prince George did have that position. For better or worse, when he spoke, people listened. His voice carried weight that could stop this harassment immediately. The question was whether he had the courage to use that voice when it mattered most. He looked one more time at his parents, hoping for some sign that they might turn around and handle this themselves. But they remained focused on their official duties, trusting that their son would remain safely at their side as he had been taught. The moment of decision had arrived. Prince George took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and made a choice that would define not just this day, but his understanding of what it truly meant to be a future king. The moment Prince George made his decision, something remarkable happened. All of his nervousness seemed to disappear, replaced by a calm sense of purpose that surprised even him. His steps became steady and confident as he quietly moved away from his parents' side, heading directly toward the group of disruptive tourists. His movement was so natural and self-assured that at first, nobody noticed what was happening. The castle officials continued their discussion with his parents, the security personnel maintained their positions, and the tourists remained focused on their inappropriate entertainment. Prince George moved through the courtyard like he belonged there, which, of course, he did more than anyone else present. As he got closer to the group, Prince George could hear their comments more clearly, and they were even worse than he had imagined. The tourists were not just trying to get the guard to react. They were making jokes about his intelligence, his appearance, and his dedication to duty. Comments that would have been hurtful to anyone, but were particularly cruel when directed at someone who couldn't respond or defend himself. The young prince felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting angry wouldn't help the situation. What was needed here was not emotion but authority, the kind of quiet, dignified authority that his family had been demonstrating for centuries. When Prince George was about 10 feet away from the group, one of the tourists finally noticed him approaching. The man did a double take, clearly recognizing that this wasn't just another curious bystander. There was something about the way Prince George carried himself, combined with his obvious quality of dress and his unmistakable resemblance to his famous parents, that immediately suggested his importance. "Hey," the tourist whispered to his companions. "Is that—" But before anyone could finish the question, Prince George had arrived at the edge of their circle. He stood there for a moment, taking in the full scene. The harassed guard maintaining his professional composure despite the ongoing mockery, the tourists with their phones out recording their entertainment, and the small crowd of other visitors who had gathered to watch, but seemed uncomfortable with what they were seeing. The effect of Prince George's presence was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were lowered. The exaggerated poses and silly faces ceased instantly. Even people who didn't immediately recognize who he was could sense that someone important had arrived on the scene. Prince George's appearance was unmistakably royal. His perfectly tailored clothes, his confident posture, and most importantly, his natural air of authority, made it clear that this was not an ordinary 11-year-old boy. This was someone who had been born and raised to command respect, and even in casual settings that training showed. The guard, still maintaining his position and forward gaze as required by protocol, couldn't look directly at Prince George. But there was a subtle change in his posture, a slight straightening of his already perfect stance that suggested he was aware of the royal presence nearby. The tourists stood frozen, suddenly realizing that their harmless fun had been observed by someone who very clearly did not find it amusing. The man who had been making faces at the guard actually took a step backward, his expression changing from amusement to uncertainty and then to growing alarm as recognition dawned. "Oh my God," whispered one of the women in the group. "That's Prince George." The words rippled through the small crowd of onlookers, creating a buzz of excitement mixed with embarrassment. Other tourists began reaching for their phones, but this time to capture the unexpected royal encounter, not to mock a defenseless guard. Prince George remained perfectly still for several long seconds, allowing the full impact of his presence to settle over the scene. This was a technique he had observed his parents use countless times. Sometimes the most powerful statement you could make was simply to be present and let people draw their own conclusions about their behavior. The silence stretched on, becoming increasingly uncomfortable for the tourists who had been causing the disturbance. They began looking at each other uncertainly, clearly realizing that their actions had been witnessed by possibly the worst person they could have imagined, the future King of England himself. During this moment of silence, Prince George found himself thinking about all the lessons his family had taught him about leadership. True authority, they had always said, didn't come from shouting or making threats. It came from presence, from dignity, and from the quiet confidence that came with knowing you were doing the right thing. The young guard remained at his post, but Prince George could see the relief in the subtle relaxation of his shoulders. Help had arrived, and it had arrived in a form that these disruptive tourists could neither ignore nor dismiss. Other visitors in the courtyard began to notice the commotion, or rather the sudden lack of commotion. Word spread quickly through the crowd that Prince George was present, and people began gathering at a respectful distance to observe what would happen next. Castle security, too, became aware that something significant was occurring. Without abandoning their primary duty of protecting the royal family, several officers began moving closer to the scene, ready to provide support if needed. Prince George's parents, still engaged in their official discussion, remained unaware of the drama unfolding nearby. This added to the surreal quality of the moment. Here was their 11-year-old son, handling a delicate public situation entirely on his own, using nothing but his presence and his understanding of appropriate behavior. The tourists who had been harassing the guard now found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't continue their inappropriate behavior in front of a member of the royal family, but they also couldn't simply walk away without acknowledging what had happened. They were trapped by their own actions and by the social expectations that Prince George's presence had immediately imposed on the situation. The young prince stood there calmly, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture he had learned from watching his father during official events. He wasn't trying to look intimidating or angry. He was simply being present, being royal, and allowing that presence to speak for itself. In the space of just a few moments, Prince George had transformed the entire dynamic of the scene. What had been a situation where a defenseless guard was being mocked by thoughtless tourists had become a moment where those same tourists found themselves being silently judged by the future king they had sworn allegiance to through their British citizenship or their respect for the institution of monarchy. The stage was now set for what would come next, and everyone present seemed to understand that whatever Prince George chose to say or do would be remembered for a very long time. When Prince George finally spoke, his voice was clear, polite, and carried the kind of natural authority that couldn't be taught, only inherited through generations of royal breeding and careful education. Every word was chosen with the precision his tutors had drilled into him, but delivered with a sincerity that came from his genuine concern for the harassed guard. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the group of tourists with perfect courtesy. "I hope you're enjoying your visit to Windsor Castle today." The effect of these simple words was electric. Several of the tourists actually jumped slightly at the sound of his voice, as if they had been hoping he might simply observe and then leave without saying anything. The realization that he was actually going to engage with them directly seemed to increase their nervousness dramatically. "Your Royal Highness," stammered one of the men, clearly struggling to remember the proper way to address a member of the royal family. We were just—" Prince George raised his hand slightly. a gentle gesture that managed to be both polite and commanding at the same time. "I can see what you were doing," he said calmly, "and I wanted to take a moment to talk with you about it." The young prince's tone was not angry or accusatory. Instead, it carried the patient quality of a teacher preparing to share something important with students who had made an honest mistake. This approach, which he had learned from watching his parents handle difficult situations, was far more effective than shouting or making threats could ever be. "This gentleman," Prince George continued, gesturing respectfully toward the guard, "is a member of Her Majesty's Guard. He has dedicated his life to serving our country and protecting institutions like this castle that represent centuries of British history and tradition." As he spoke, Prince George moved slightly closer to the guard, positioning himself in a way that was clearly protective. The symbolism was unmistakable. The future king standing beside one of his soldiers, demonstrating the bond between the monarchy and the military that had defined British society for generations. "These guards undergo months of intensive training to earn their positions," the prince explained, his voice growing slightly stronger as he warmed to his subject. "They learn discipline, dedication, and sacrifice that most of us can barely imagine, standing perfectly still for hours at a time in all kinds of weather, regardless of what's happening around them. That's not easy. It requires incredible mental and physical strength." Some of the tourists began looking genuinely ashamed as Prince George's words sank in. They were beginning to understand that what they had seen as a game or entertainment was actually a display of remarkable professional discipline by a trained soldier. "When you mock or harass them," Prince George continued, "you're not just being disrespectful to one person. You're showing disrespect for the entire military tradition that keeps our country safe and free. You're making fun of the very people who would risk their lives to protect you if the situation ever required it." The young prince paused for a moment, allowing his words to have their full impact. He could see that his message was getting through. The tourist's expressions had changed from amusement and defiance to embarrassment and genuine regret. "I understand that you might not have realized the significance of what these guards do," Prince George said, his tone remaining kind but firm. "Many visitors don't fully appreciate the training and dedication required for this role. But now that you do understand, I'm sure you'll want to show them the respect they deserve." One of the women in the group stepped forward slightly, her face flushed with shame. "Your Royal Highness, we're so sorry. We didn't mean any harm. We thought it was—" "I know you didn't mean any harm," Prince George replied gently, "but sometimes we can cause harm without meaning to. The important thing is that we learn from our mistakes and do better going forward." The young prince then did something that surprised everyone present, including the guard himself. He turned slightly toward the soldier and, while still respecting the protocol that prevented the guard from breaking his position, spoke to him directly. "Thank you for your service," Prince George said clearly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Your dedication and professionalism, especially under difficult circumstances, represent the very best of our military tradition. It's an honor to have you protecting this historic place." The guard couldn't respond verbally or turn to acknowledge the prince, but there was a subtle shift in his posture that suggested deep appreciation for the support. Other guards stationed nearby, who had been aware of the situation but unable to intervene, also seemed to stand a little straighter, proud that their colleague had been defended by the future king himself. Turning back to the tourists, Prince George continued, "I hope this helps you understand why we hold our royal guards in such high regard. They're not here for entertainment. They're here as representatives of centuries of military excellence and dedication to duty." The transformation in the tourists was remarkable. What had started as a group of people looking for harmless fun had become a collection of individuals who genuinely understood the gravity of their mistake. Several of them began offering apologies, not just to Prince George, but directing their words toward the guard himself. "We're truly sorry," said one of the men. "We had no idea. We completely understand now." Another tourist, the woman who had actually touched the guard's uniform, looked particularly distressed. "I feel terrible about this. Is there anything we can do to make up for our behavior?" Prince George considered the question thoughtfully. "The best thing you can do is to remember this lesson and share it with others. Help people understand that these guards deserve our respect and admiration, not our mockery. And perhaps if you post anything on social media about your visit here, you could share what you've learned about the importance and dignity of military Service. The suggestion was brilliant. Prince George was turning what could have been a viral video mocking a British soldier into an opportunity to educate people about the honor and sacrifice represented by the Royal Guards. As word of what was happening spread through the nearby crowd, other tourists began approaching to listen. Many of them had witnessed similar inappropriate behavior toward guards at various royal locations and were interested to hear what the young prince had to say about it. Prince George's intervention had accomplished something remarkable. Not only had he stopped the immediate harassment and restored the guards' dignity, but he had created a teachable moment that would likely influence the behavior of many more people than just the original offenders. His respectful but firm approach had demonstrated that true authority came not from punishment or humiliation, but from education and appeal to people's better nature. Within minutes of Prince George's intervention, the atmosphere in the courtyard had completely transformed. What had begun as an uncomfortable situation with tourists harassing a royal guard had become something entirely different, a moment of genuine education and mutual respect that would be remembered by everyone present. The tourists who had been causing the disturbance were now engaging in respectful conversation with other visitors about the role and importance of the royal guards. The shame they had initially felt was being replaced by genuine appreciation for what they had learned, and several of them had approached other guards stationed nearby to offer sincere apologies. But perhaps more significantly, other tourists who had witnessed Prince George's handling of the situation were pulling out their phones, not to mock or harass anyone, but to record their own messages of respect and admiration for the guards and for the young prince who had stood up for them. "I can't believe what I just witnessed," said one elderly visitor, speaking into her phone as she recorded a video message. "Prince George, who can't be more than 11 or 12 years old, just gave the most mature and respectful lesson about honor and dignity that I've ever heard. The way he defended that guard while still treating those tourists with kindness, that's real leadership." Word of the incident began spreading beyond the immediate area as visitors shared what they had witnessed. Social media posts started appearing with hashtags like "Counter Prince George Leadership" and "Respect the Guards," accompanied by photos and videos that captured the dignity and maturity of the young prince's intervention. Family from Canada, who had been visiting the castle, approached Prince George's security detail to ask if they could somehow convey their admiration for what the prince had done. "We've been teaching our children about respect and standing up for others," the father explained. "Seeing Prince George actually do it at his age, with such grace and wisdom, it's exactly the kind of example we want them to see." The guard who had been harassed remained at his post, but his entire demeanor had changed. The tension and stress that had been visible in his posture during the harassment had been replaced by a sense of pride and validation. He stood even straighter if such a thing were possible, clearly moved by the support he had received from the future king of the Royal Guard stationed throughout the castle grounds had become aware of what had happened through the discreet communication systems they used. The story was spreading through their ranks, generating a sense of appreciation and loyalty toward Prince George that would likely last throughout their entire careers. Castle staff members who had witnessed the incident were also deeply impressed. These were people who had worked around the royal family for years, and they recognized something special in Prince George's handling of the situation. His combination of authority and compassion, his ability to educate rather than simply punish, and his natural instinct to protect those under his future care marked him as someone who truly understood what royal leadership was meant to be. The castle's head of operations, who had been giving the tour to Prince George's parents, eventually became aware of what had transpired. Rather than being concerned about a security breach or protocol violation, he was impressed by the young prince's maturity and judgment. In 30 years of working with the royal family, he would later tell his colleagues, "I've never seen such natural leadership instincts in someone so young." He handled that situation better than most adults would have done. Meanwhile, professional photographers who had been covering the royal visit began capturing images of the aftermath. Prince George, speaking respectfully with various tourists, the renewed sense of dignity surrounding the guards, and the general atmosphere of mutual respect that now filled the courtyard. These images would later appear in newspapers and magazines around the world, accompanied by stories about the young prince's intervention. The headlines would praise his maturity, his understanding of his role, and his instinctive protection of those who serve the monarchy. International news outlets picked up the story within hours. The combination of a young royal showing remarkable leadership in the universal theme of standing up for those who cannot defend themselves made it the kind of story that resonated across cultural and national boundaries. Future King shows true leadership at age 11 read one headline. Prince George's wisdom beyond his years declared another. But perhaps the most touching coverage came from military publications and veterans organizations, who recognized in the young prince's actions a deep understanding of the bond between leadership and service. The British public's reaction was particularly strong. Social media was flooded with messages of pride and admiration for Prince George, with many people commenting that his behavior gave them hope for the future of the monarchy. Parents shared the story with their children as an example of how to stand up for what's right, regardless of your age. Veterans groups issued statements praising Prince George for his support of active military personnel. The young prince demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we hope to see from our future monarch, read one statement. His instinctive understanding that leadership means protecting and honoring those who serve under you bodes well for the future of our military-monarchy relationship. Perhaps most remarkably, the incident sparked a broader conversation about respect for service members and the importance of understanding military tradition. Tourism authorities at royal sites across the country reported an increase in respectful behavior toward guards, with visitors often sharing the story of Prince George's intervention as an example of how to properly appreciate these dedicated soldiers. The guard who had been at the center of the incident, later identified as David Thompson from Manchester, would eventually be interviewed by military publications about his experience. While maintaining his professional discretion about specific details, he expressed deep gratitude for Prince George's support. It meant the world to have the future king recognize the importance of what we do, he said. In that moment, I felt the full weight and honor of my position in a way I never had before. The ripple effects of Prince George's intervention continued to spread throughout the day and beyond. His parents, when they learned what had happened, were both proud of his actions and impressed by his mature handling of a difficult situation. The incident became a defining moment in his young life, marking the first time he had independently exercised the kind of moral authority that would characterize his future reign. By the end of the day, what could have been an embarrassing incident reflecting poorly on British tourism and respect for military service had instead become a powerful story about leadership, dignity, and the importance of standing up for others. And at the center of it all was an 11-year-old boy who had instinctively understood that true royal power lies not in privilege, but in the responsibility to protect and honor those who serve. In the days and weeks that followed the incident at Windsor Castle, the impact of Prince George's intervention continued to ripple outward in ways that surprised even those closest to the royal family. What had begun as a spontaneous act of decency had evolved into something much larger, a defining moment that would influence not only Prince George's own understanding of leadership, but also public perceptions of what the monarchy could represent in the modern world. The immediate aftermath of the incident had been handled with characteristic royal discretion. Prince George's parents, when they learned what had happened, chose to address it privately with their son rather than making any public statements. This conversation, held that evening in the privacy of their quarters, became one of the most important discussions of Prince George's young life. "We're incredibly proud of what you did today," his father, Prince William, had told him. "But more than that, we're proud of how you did it. You showed respect for everyone involved, the guard, the tourists, and the institution itself. That's what real leadership looks like." His mother, Catherine, had added her own perspective. "What you did today wasn't just about helping one person in one moment. You showed everyone watching what it means to use privilege responsibly. That's a lesson that will stay with people for the rest of their lives." But Prince George himself was still processing what had happened. In the quiet moments before sleep that night, he found himself thinking not about the praise he was receiving, but about the look of relief and gratitude he had seen in the guard's eyes. That human connection, the understanding that his actions had genuinely helped another person, was what made the entire experience feel meaningful rather than just ceremonial. The story continued to generate positive coverage in the media, But what impressed royal watchers most was how the coverage focused not on Prince George's royal status, but on his character and judgment. Columnists and commentators noted that his intervention had been notable, not because he was a prince, but because he had shown the kind of moral courage that anyone could admire, regardless of their feelings about the monarchy itself. Educational institutions across the country began incorporating the story into their curricula as an example of effective leadership and conflict resolution. Teachers found that students responded strongly to the idea that someone their own age could handle a difficult situation with such maturity and wisdom. The story became a tool for discussing topics like respect, responsibility, and the importance of standing up for others. Military academies and training programs also took notice of the incident. The way Prince George had understood and articulated the importance of military service resonated deeply with career soldiers and officers. Several military leaders privately expressed their hope that this early demonstration of support for service members indicated the kind of monarch Prince George might become. For the royal guards themselves, the impact was particularly significant. The story had brought widespread public attention to their role and responsibilities in a way that emphasized their professionalism and dedication, rather than treating them as tourist curiosities. Guard commanders reported increased morale and a sense of validation for the important work their personnel performed. David Thompson, the guard who had been harassed, found that his experience had transformed from a source of stress into a source of pride. Fellow guards and military personnel treated him with additional respect, not as someone who had been victimized, but as someone who had been personally defended by the future king. The incident had elevated both his individual status and the status of his entire unit. The tourists who had been involved in the original harassment also experienced lasting effects from their encounter with Prince George. Several of them later gave interviews to local newspapers in their home countries, sharing what they had learned about British military tradition and expressing their changed perspective on service and sacrifice. One of them, a business executive from Germany, returned home and organized a presentation about his experience for his company's leadership team. "I learned more about respect and dignity from an 11-year-old prince than I had learned in 40 years of adult life," he told his colleagues. "It completely changed how I think about leadership and responsibility." The incident also had implications for royal protocol and training. Palace officials recognized that Prince George's natural instincts had led him to make exactly the right decision, but they also understood the importance of preparing him for similar situations in the future. Additional training was quietly added to his education, focusing on public interaction and crisis management skills. More broadly, the incident contributed to evolving public perceptions of the royal family's role in contemporary British society. Rather than being seen as distant figures removed from everyday concerns, the royals were increasingly viewed as active participants in maintaining the values and traditions that defined British culture. International observers also took note of the incident's significance. Diplomatic personnel from various countries reported back to their governments about Prince George's demonstration of leadership qualities, contributing to global perceptions of stability and continuity in British institutions. The story became part of royal folklore, joining the collection of anecdotes and incidents that define how each generation of royals is remembered. Palace historians privately noted that it was rare for such a young member of the royal family to have such a defining moment of independent action and moral courage. As months passed, the incident continued to influence Prince George's own development. He began paying closer attention to situations where his position might allow him to help others, and his tutors noticed an increased interest in learning about leadership, military history, and public service. The guard rotation at royal sites also evolved in response to the increased public awareness generated by the incident. Training programs began, including modules on handling public attention and maintaining dignity under difficult circumstances, using Prince George's intervention as an example of the kind of support guards could expect from the royal family. Perhaps most significantly, the incident established Prince George as a figure of moral authority in his own right, separate from his parents' influence. Public opinion polls consistently showed high approval ratings for the young prince, with respondents frequently citing the Windsor Castle incident as evidence of his good character and future potential as a leader. Years later, when royal biographers and historians would look back on Prince George's childhood, They would identify this moment as the first clear indication of the kind of king he was destined to become, not through dramatic gestures or grand proclamations, but through quiet acts of decency, respect for service, and an intuitive understanding that true royal authority comes from protecting and honoring those who cannot protect themselves. The young guard, who had stood so perfectly still while being mocked, had no idea that his dignity and professionalism would be defended by a future king, or that this defense would become a defining moment in both of their lives. But in the end, that's exactly what happened, and both the monarchy and the military were stronger for it.